Many of you know that on my TikTok I do a series called World Leaders in 1 Minute, but I also cover US elections, and honestly I have a little more fun doing that. So I figured I'd bring that to YouTube. I'm covering every single election for governor and US Senate in 2022, and I'm gonna split them in half, so this is gonna be the first half of US Senate elections this year. I'll be making 35 of these videos, but there's technically 36 elections, and I'll explain that later. On my TikTok it's kind of a source of confusion, because with the governor's races I go in order of when the primary was, but for Senate elections I just go in whatever order I want. Mainly because Senate elections are a lot more static, you know, they're just, some of them are kind of boring, you know, incumbents are guaranteed to win basically, so we're gonna cover the more boring ones today. We begin with Indiana, which is in my opinion the most boring one this year. Incumbent Republican Senator Todd Young is running for a second term and ran unopposed for the Republican nomination. Meanwhile, Hammond Mayor Thomas McDermott Jr. won the Democratic nomination unopposed. And behavioral therapist James Synyak won the Libertarian nomination unopposed. Very interesting, that took like 10 seconds. For 3 different parties. The Libertarian Party generally does well enough in Indiana for me to consider them a part of this race. They got 4.4% of the vote in the last Senate election and 11.4% of the vote in the last election for governor. But yeah, there's no Trump endorsement drama, no primaries, it's pretty boring. So the race is Todd Young versus Thomas McDermott Jr. versus James Synyak. And Politico rates this race solid Republican. But another close contender for the most boring election is the one in Idaho. One way I made it fun for myself was by actually filming the TikTok in Idaho. Incumbent Republican Senator Mike Crapo is running for a 5th term. Wow. He had 4 challengers in the Republican primary, which all things considered is pretty surprising for a state with not that many people and a 4-term incumbent, but he still won with 67.1% of the vote. The Democratic primary was between 2 very well-known candidates. Not really. You have former state house candidate David Roth and real estate developer Ben Persley. Roth won with 57.8% of the vote and carried 41 of Idaho's 44 counties, and that's probably the most interesting part of this election. The Constitution Party is also barely worth mentioning. Their nominee Ray Ritz took 6.4% of the vote in 2016, and I have no idea why, but he's running again, and I can't find a high quality photo of him, so we're gonna use a stick figure. So the race is Mike Crapo versus David Roth versus Ray Ritz. Politico rates this race solid Republican, and to reiterate, this is not a race to watch because Crapo has never won with less than 68% of the vote. Race number 3 is the one in Oregon. This race could have been somewhat competitive, but it turned out not to be, so let me explain. Incumbent Democratic Senator Ron Wyden first won a special election in 1996 and is now running for a 5th full term. He faced 2 minor candidates in the Democratic primary and won with 89.5% of the vote. There were 7 candidates in the Republican primary, but the top 2 were business owner Darren Harvick and 2020 nominee Joe Ray Perkins. Perkins ended up winning with 33.3% of the vote and carried 25 of the state's 36 counties. So the race is Ron Wyden versus Joe Ray Perkins. As I mentioned earlier, this race could have been like the slightest bit competitive. Politico originally rated this race likely Democratic, but they moved it to solid Democratic after Perkins won the nomination owing to her support for things like QAnon, however you say it. I still don't know. But maybe this time around Republicans will learn that nominating fringe candidates in a state like Oregon is not a winning strategy. Next we have Arkansas, which is a state I visited for the first time just a few weeks ago. Incumbent Republican Senator John Boozman is running for a 3rd term. Also, I mispronounced it in my TikTok, but why is Boozman spelled Boozman? Unlike most Republican senators running for re-election in a solid state, Boozman actually had a significant primary challenger. And not one that you'd really expect either. Because usually in the case that I mentioned, you'll have like a state senator or maybe like one of the statewide elected officials like the comptroller or the attorney general or something, but no, you had former NFL player Jake Beckett. Another name I mispronounced in my TikTok. I like these videos because they give me another chance. Beckett attacked Boozman for not being conservative enough and for being disloyal to Trump, which makes no sense because Boozman is actually endorsed by Trump. The biggest issue was not whether Boozman would come in first, it's whether he would win 50% of the vote in the first round, because if not, then he would go to a runoff. But he avoided that and won 58% of the vote. Arkansas has had one hell of a realignment very quickly. They had 2 Democratic senators like fairly recently. In fact, in 2010, there was an incumbent Democrat and Boozman defeated her. And now they had trouble finding any high-profile candidates for this election, which was reflected by 63% of voters being undecided just 22 days before the primary. The winner was small business owner Natalie James, who won with 54.1% of the vote and carried 55 of the state's 76 counties. So the race is John Boozman versus Natalie James. Politico rates this race solid Republican. All right, let's talk about the Dakotas. Let's start with South Dakota. Incumbent Republican Senator and Senate Minority Whip John John Thune is running for a 4th term. Trump called Thune a rhino or Republican in name only for not trying to overturn the 2020 election, and he encouraged South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem to try and primary him. But that didn't happen, and there were also no other high-profile candidates. He easily beat 2 unknown challengers and won with 72.2% of the vote. Democrats recruited Northern State University political science professor Brian Bings, and he won the nomination unopposed. So the race is John Thune versus Brian Bings. In Thune's first election back in 2004, he unseated an 18-year incumbent himself, but history doesn't really look likely to repeat itself, because Politico rates this race solid Republican. But I will say I have a lot of respect for Bings because he came out with a really good ad, which is pretty unexpected for a candidate with such little chance at winning in the solid Republican state. But I encourage you to go check it out because it's one of the best ads I've seen all year. And now let's go to North Dakota, which is a criminally underrated state to visit, but the politics in this election specifically, not so interesting. Incumbent Republican Senator John Hoeven is running for a 3rd term. These Senate elections are so interesting because the last 3 elections in a row have all had a Republican incumbent named John. Hoeven faced only one minor candidate in the Republican primary and won with 78.4% of the vote. The Democratic primary was contested between small business owner Michael Steele and Professor Katrina Christensen, and Christensen won with 76.8% of the vote. I just realized watching this now that I totally forgot to say the race is John Hoeven versus Katrina Christensen. Now, fun fact that's gonna blow your mind, North Dakota had a Democrat in the Senate as recently as 2019, only 3 years ago. But it's generally a deep red state, and this election is basically just a formality. Hoeven has been a senator for 12 years already, which, you know, he's got incumbency, but he was also governor of North Dakota for 10 years before that. In 2016, he won by 61 points, which is the highest margin of any contested Senate election during the entire 2010s decade. So yeah, even though Politico rates this race solid Republican, I think there should be a category above solid, and this election should be in it. All right, let's go to New York. This is another very boring one. In fact, I got comments from multiple New Yorkers that were like, I didn't even know we were having a Senate election this year. But incumbent Democratic Senator Chuck Schumer is running for a 5th term, and you hear the name Chuck Schumer, and you could probably assume why you're not hearing about it, because this is pretty much the Democratic equivalent of North Dakota. There's no way Schumer wins by any less than 40%. I mean, he's the Senate Majority Leader, and New York is a very blue state, but also people in New York seem to like Schumer, and he campaigns a lot, which is surprising for someone whose seat is basically guaranteed anyways. One poll even found that he would beat arguably the state's most well-known politician, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, if she challenged him for the nomination. So yeah, nobody bothered to challenge him for the nomination, and the primary was canceled. There was also no Republican primary because the state GOP selected TV host Joe Pinion, and no one else gathered enough signatures to force a primary. So the race is Chuck Schumer versus Joe Pinion, and Politico rates this race solid Democratic. Another very boring race is happening in Illinois, another state that's actually decently Republican, except for the one city that makes the whole state dynamic change. Incumbent Democratic Senator Tammy Duckworth is running for a 2nd term and won the Democratic nomination unopposed. The Republicans had a fractured 7-candidate primary with no clear frontrunner. The top 2 appeared to be attorney Kathy Salvi and former police officer Peggy Hubbard, and Salvi ended up winning with just 30.2% of the vote. She carried only 15 counties while Hubbard carried 86, which is pretty lopsided, but again, everybody in Illinois lives in Cook County. So the election is Tammy Duckworth versus Kathy Salvi. This Senate seat holds the distinction of being the one that's gone the longest without re-electing an incumbent. Every single election since 1986 has been won by a different person, including Barack Obama. But it looks like that's about to change because Politico rates this race solid Democratic. In what's probably the most lopsided Senate election besides New York, let's look at Maryland. Incumbent Democratic Senator Chris Van Hollen is running for a 2nd term. Business owner Michelle Lawrence Smith was the only one to challenge him for the Democratic nomination. All things considered, she did pretty well, but Van Hollen still won with 80.8% of the vote. The Republicans had 10 candidates, none of whom had ever held public office before. The GOP tried to get term-limited Governor Larry Hogan to run, but he probably wouldn't have won anyways, so he decided against it. The primary's eventual winner was home building contractor Chris Chaffee, who won with just 20.8% of the vote and carried 18 of the state's 24 county equivalents. Of all the elections I've covered this year, 20.8% is the lowest percent of the vote for any primary winner. So the race is Chris Van Hollen versus Chris Chaffee. Politico rates the race solid Democratic. And now let me explain what I talked about at the beginning of the video. In one state, there is a special election and a regular election, but they're basically exactly the same. And that state is California. So for context, incumbent Democratic Senator Alex Padilla was first appointed in 2021 after Kamala Harris resigned to become vice president. He's running in both elections. The first election is a completely arbitrary special election to fill the final few weeks of Harris's term. California does blanket primaries, so all candidates regardless of party run in the same primary, and the top 2 advance to the November election. There were 8 candidates. Padilla won with 55.6% of the vote, and attorney Mark Muser came in second with 21.8%. Padilla won 42 counties while Muser won 16. This election will be held on November 8th along with the regular election for a full 6-year term between 2023 2023 and 2029. That doesn't even sound like a real year. Although Padilla's young, so he'll probably be in office till 35, 41, 47, I don't know, like 2053. Because of this weird 2 elections being held at the same time, it's hypothetically possible for somebody else to win the special election, serve for like 7 weeks, and then be replaced by Padilla again on January 3rd, or vice versa. There were 23 candidates for this election, although I don't know why you'd run in this election but not the special election, like just do both. Padilla won this blanket primary again with 54.4% of the vote, and Muser got 14.8%, but this time Padilla won 54 counties and Muser only won 4. So both races are Alex Padilla versus Mark Muser, which in and of itself is a rematch of the 2018 Secretary of State election. Politico rates this race solid Democratic, but Muser did already accomplish something huge, being the first Republican to make it to the general election since 2012, because in 2016 and 2018, the top 2 candidates in the blanket primary were both Democrats. Next, we got Kansas, and I had fun making this video, not because of the results, because it's solid Republican. Let me just get that out of the way. Incumbent Republican Senator Jerry Moran is running for a 3rd term. He easily won the Republican primary with 80.6% of the vote against a candidate who also ran in the primary in Oklahoma. The only thing that makes this race interesting was the Democratic primary. There were 6 candidates, most notably former Kansas City, Kansas Mayor Mark Hollen. As the only candidate who'd ever held public office before, you'd think he'd easily win the primary. But as we've seen in 2022 and all across the country, holding public office before is not really that much of a qualifier anymore. Dr. Oz, Herschel Walker, Blake Masters. So yeah, you'd think Hollen would easily win, but that's not the case. I mean, just look at this map. We got 3 things that haven't happened in any other election I've covered. 5 candidates won a county, there was a tie in more than one county, and there was a 3-way tie in one county. Hollen still did win with 38.1% of the vote, but this map looks like somebody threw up all over it. And ironically, the only candidate that didn't win any counties was the one who won the nomination in 2016. So the race is Jerry Moran versus Mark Holland. Alright, let's go to South Carolina. Not literally, but figuratively. I actually went to South Carolina for the first time 4 months ago. Pretty awesome state. Incumbent Republican Senator Tim Scott was first appointed by Governor Nikki Haley in 2013, and now he's running for a 2nd full term. Interestingly, 3 years ago, he made a promise that this 2nd term would be his last, and that he won't seek re-election in 2028, which just so happens to be a presidential election year, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. My personal opinion is that Tim Scott will be the vice presidential pick for the Republican ticket in 2024, 28, or 32. He ran unopposed for the Republican nomination, though, so it looks like it's going to be a pretty easy last go-around. The Democrats had 3 candidates. They were State Representative Crystal Matthews, author Catherine Fleming Bruce, and former House of Representatives candidate Angela Jeter. Remarkably, the vote was split almost perfectly evenly between all 3. They also split the counties pretty evenly, with Matthews winning 13, Bruce winning 16, and Jeter winning 17. Even though Matthews finished 2nd in the primary, she won the runoff 2 weeks later with 55.8% of the vote and carried 33 counties. This is the only election I've covered in 2022 where the winner of the runoff was not the winner of the first round. So the race is Tim Scott versus Crystal Matthews, and Politico already rated this race solid Republican, but it's gotten even more solid Republican because recently Matthews has been subject of a lot of controversy after an audio leak that had her talking about her constituents in a very rude way. She basically said a lot of very racist things about her constituents because she represents a district with a lot of white people, and she said she has them like wrapped around her finger. A lot of Democrats are now saying that she should step aside, including the Democratic nominee for governor, Joe Cunningham. So I guess they would nominate one of the other 2 candidates if that happened, but you know, she said she's not going to step aside, so easy victory for Tim Scott nonetheless. Alright, let's check out Connecticut. Okay, so incumbent Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal is running for a 3rd term. Gonna be a big shocker here, but he got the Democratic nomination unopposed. Whatever happened to primary challengers? Like, nobody important got primary this year besides Liz Cheney, but I don't really talk about House elections, so no one important that I cover got primary. Anyway, I digress. There were originally 6 candidates in the Republican primary, but 3 of them were eliminated at the state GOP convention back in May. Of the 3 candidates left, the main 2 were former State House Minority Leader Themis Clarides and businesswoman Leora Levy. Clarides was more of a moderate, and she had the endorsement of the Connecticut Republican Party, which usually means you're going to win the nomination, but not in this case. Levy was endorsed by Trump the week before the primary, and she pulled off an upset victory, winning 50.6% of the vote and carrying 7 of Connecticut's 8 counties. So the race is Richard Blumenthal versus Leora Levy. For some reason, Politico changed this race from solid Democratic to likely Democratic right after Levy won the nomination, mostly because she'll be sharing the ballot with more moderate gubernatorial nominee Bob Stefanowski. And the polls have shown this race closer than I thought, but I think they're flukes. But let's entertain the idea of Levy winning for a second. If she won, she would be one of just 2 naturalized citizens in the US Senate, the other being Mazie Hirono. Because Levy was born in Cuba, and she's running this weird anti-communist campaign because she, you know, her family fled the Castro regime. But yeah, it's like this McCarthy era, like 1950s, we need to stop communism, which is totally a huge problem in 2022 Connecticut. Alright, we have 4 more to go, and the next one is Hawaii, which was the only primary of the year to be held on a Saturday. Incumbent Democratic Senator Brian Schatz was rather controversially appointed in 2012 and is now running for a second full term. You see, what's weird is the governor who appointed him was Neil Abercrombie, and he directly snubbed Schatz's predecessor, who'd been a senator from Hawaii for like 50 years. You see, that senator, whose name I can't pronounce, he had a pick for who he wanted to replace him after he died, but Abercrombie just said nope and appointed his lieutenant governor, Brian Schatz. But what's weird is Abercrombie got primaried in 2014, and it wasn't even close, and mostly for that reason, but the person who was supposed to be appointed ran against Schatz in the primary for the special election the same year and lost. But this time Schatz easily won the nomination with 93.6% of the vote. Of the 10 Republican candidates, the only one who'd ever held public office before was State Representative Bob McDermott, and he's one of only 4 Republicans in the entire state house. He won the nomination with 39.6% of the vote and carried 1 county. But that county is Honolulu County, so so the race is Brian Schatz versus Bob McDermott. McDermott is trying to localize this race and, make it about, specific issues to Hawaii, but it's not going to work because Politico rates this race solid Democratic. Next up is Vermont. This one has a lot of trivia. Incumbent Democratic Senator Patrick Leahy has been in the Senate for 20.4% of the time it's ever existed, but he's retiring after 8 terms. Now, Vermont is one of those small states with only 1 congressional district, so whenever a Senate seat opens up, generally the top candidate is the state's 1 representative. That's how Vermont's last 2 senators won their seats, and this election is going to be no different, because U.S. Representative Peter Welch easily won the Democratic nomination with 87.4% of the vote. The only real hope Republicans had at winning this seat is if they could convince Governor Phil Scott to run, but he declined. There were 3 candidates, but it was really a 2-way race between former U.S. Attorney Christina Nolan and U.S. Army veteran Gerald Malloy. This was another classic case of the moderate candidate versus the Trump candidate, and you'd think that would be an easy choice in Vermont because they love their moderate Republicans. I mean, I mentioned Phil Scott, right? When I first read about this election, I thought Nolan easily had it in the bag. She was pro-choice, had a lot of other moderate positions, and she would have been the first openly lesbian Republican U.S. Senate nominee. And Nolan was also endorsed by Mitch McConnell and Phil Scott. But the establishment seems to be, not the wave anymore, so Malloy won with 43% of the vote and carried 8 of Vermont's 14 counties. So the race is Peter Welch versus Gerald Malloy. After Malloy won, Politico changed this race from likely Democratic to solid Democratic. Even though one weird poll came out that had the election pretty close, it's not going to be at all. So it looks like Peter Welch will become only the 2nd Democratic senator in Vermont's history, and also the oldest new senator in U.S. history at the age of 75. There's 2 more races, and they're both in the same state, which is Oklahoma, but let's talk about the regular election first. This is the regularly scheduled election for a full 6-year term. Incumbent Republican Senator James Lankford won a special election himself back in 2014 and is now running for a 2nd full term. He had 2 primary challengers, including Pastor Jackson Lawmeyer, but still won with 67.8% of the vote. The Democratic primary had 6 candidates. The frontrunner was cybersecurity professional Madison Horn, who got 37.2% of the vote and won 56 of Oklahoma's 77 counties. But 4 other candidates split the vote pretty evenly, and thus prevented Horn from getting the required majority of the vote. Of these, the one that finished second was attorney Jason Bollinger. Horn won the runoff with 65.5% of the vote and carried 68 counties. So the race is James Lankford versus Madison Horn, and Politico rates this race solid Republican. Where most of the action is the Oklahoma special election. This one was only scheduled back in late February. Incumbent Republican Senator Jim Inhofe was most recently re-elected to a 5th full term in 2020, but he decided to retire 2 years into his term, which triggered a special election. Former U.S. Representative Kendra Horn got the Democratic nomination unopposed. As if it's not confusing enough that both Senate seats are up for election in the same year in the same state, both Democratic nominees are women with the last name Horn. There weren't many Republicans who wanted to challenge James Lankford in a Republican primary for Oklahoma's other Senate seat, so when this seat opened up, a lot of Republicans jumped into the race. 13 people ran, including several high-profile candidates like U.S. Representative Markwayne Mullin, State Senator Nathan Dahm, Trump's former EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt, and former State House Speaker T.W. Shannon. I'll be covering Alabama next episode, but similar to what happened in that Senate race, Inhofe's Chief of Staff Luke Holland was also a candidate, and he had Inhofe's endorsement, but that didn't seem to matter all that much looking at the results. Mullin finished the first round with 43.6% of the vote, but again didn't get the required majority, so him and Shannon advanced to a runoff. 8 weeks later, Mullin easily won the runoff with 65.1% of the vote and carried all but 1 county. So the race is Markwayne Mullin versus Kendra Horn. This is going to be a huge shocker, but Politico rates this race solid Republican. Kendra Horn has tweeted a few times about how they're in striking distance and this race could be close, but there's been 5 Senate elections in a row in Oklahoma where the Democrat has failed to win a single county. Maybe that streak will be broken this year in one of the 2 Senate elections. It would be interesting if it happened in one but not the other. I suspect there will be a fair amount of people who vote for James Lankford for the regular Senate seat but vote for Kendra Horn in this election because she was a former representative, higher name recognition, and she was known for being bipartisan. But yeah, neither election is going to be close. close. And that concludes the 18 less interesting Senate elections. Next time I'll do all of the other Senate elections in a video I suspect will be much longer.